Welcome to the first ever Night Talks podcast. My name is Nate, and in the next few minutes, I'm going to lay out my plan for this podcast. I'm 33 years old, and I've been studying law, crime, and the darkness of the world for nearly 20 years. It all started with CSI and Sherlock Holmes when I was 14. So after many years and many books, I've gathered a decent amount of knowledge, and it turned into an obsession. And it is now what fuels my desire to create a podcast. The idea for my podcast started with the idea to begin with a true crime podcast called A Walk in the Dark, which is currently still in the works. But the process is long and research takes time. This podcast is going to be a bit more freeform in its presentation, the format being loosely inspired by Aaron Mahnke's Cabinet of Curiosities. This will be short episodes consisting of a variety of things regarding true crime and similar subjects. The episodes will be between 5 to 15 minutes, depending on what the subject is, though I think this one's going to be a little bit longer. Depending on how the idea I have is accepted, I may decide to move on to bigger things, such as short stories or interviews. But I will make the promise that I will not ad-lib this. I will write a basic script for every episode, so they will maintain a basic structure. I'll be right back. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, let's take a walk through the grounds and history of one of my favorite places, Traverse City State Hospital, or as it was once known, the Northern Michigan Asylum. First, a little background. In the late 1800s, there was a large number of asylums being built in the States to care for residents dealing with mental illness. Dr. Thomas Kirkbride was prominent in the design of these institutions. Michigan began its journey in Kalamazoo and then Pontiac. These facilities filled up quickly, and the need for another arose. Traverse City was founded in 1852 by Perry Hanna. Back then it was just a small sawmill town, and remained that way until 1864. Hanna knew that the lumber wouldn't last forever, so he set out to find something that would keep his town alive. By using connections and knowledge he had from the lumber business, Traverse City became the place the next asylum would be built. And in early 1882, Gordon Lloyd was chosen to design what would become known as the Northern Michigan Asylum. The main portion of the sprawling asylum would be designed under what was called the Kirkbride Plan. It would be something quite advanced for its time. This building that would become known as Building 50 would be nearly a quarter mile in length. The overall area would blow right past 300,000 square feet and would reach heights of over 70 feet. This building was complete with central heat, electric lights, and ventilators to remove germs. The iconic red spires were part of the ventilator. As the germs were removed, they moved through the ducts and upward by utilizing the chimney effect. Construction would begin the following April, 1883. This would require over 1 million bricks just for the central building. In this era of hand tools and mules, it was astonishing that the construction took just under 3 years. After its completion in the fall of 1885, the hospital was ready to open to its first patients. It opened November 1885 under the supervision of Dr. James Decker Munson and remained as such until 1924. He's the man that our local hospital is now named for. Dr. Munson believed firmly in the beauty as therapy idea that Dr. Kirkbride taught. This meant that being treated decently like humans the way they deserved, through kindness and comfort, the residents of the hospital could make progress. This went as far as banning all restraints, like the straitjacket. Kirkbride and Munson were trying to help those in need many years before medication was a part of mental illness. This meant that they had to use what they had the best that they could. Upon opening, the asylum was set to serve almost 40 counties. This included the Upper Peninsula. The massive building filled quickly. This caused an immediate demand for more space. So as Traverse City neared the 19th century, less than a decade after opening, the construction of the cottages was started. The men went to the south cottages, and the women went to the north. The remaining cottages were used for places for recovery and contagious illnesses. This hospital expanded to make more space for people with these illnesses, as well as the elderly, and an acting rehab for addicts. As part of the humanness that Munson believed in, he wanted to give the patients a feeling of purpose. Some of these activities included building furniture, canning, and farming. One of the highlights of the grounds is all the trees that are planted there. There were many different kinds. From the beginning, the asylum used a portion of its land for farming, so that as a whole it would be self-sufficient. The patients that lived in the asylum helped with the farming and the care of animals. This farm was home to the champion cow, Traverse Calantha Walker. She produced over 2,000 pounds of milk in just under 16 years. The place that marks her grave can be found on the grounds, not far from the barns. The farming portion of the asylum was ended in 1950. The hospital thrived for many years, but even the comfort of the asylum and the quiet of northern Michigan could not last forever. As Traverse City moved into the 20th century, modernism made its way into the untouched parts of the town. This prevailing idea led to changes. These changes in the medical field would be the hospital's breaking point. A portion of the original building was deemed less than safe due to fire hazards. The administrative section was eventually torn down in 1963 and rebuilt to eliminate these hazards. As medicine and the ideas of treatment advanced, budget concerns arose as well. This eventually led to the hospital's closing in 1989. This meant that nearly 150 residents that resided there at the time were just put out on the street, and nearly 200 people lost their jobs. The Northern Michigan Asylum had opened 104 years prior with the intention of helping people. It closed as the Traverse City State Hospital, having done exactly that to the best of its ability. Literally, to the very day it couldn't anymore. Now, this is only part of the story of the hospital. There are more stories, like the story of Jack Ferguson, the doctor who could do a 15-minute lobotomy and learn the value of medicine, or the nurse that started a training program for other nurses. And I may get back to those later in the podcast. But for now, this is where our story ends. I've heard many different takes on what really happened in the hospital. I've heard the stories of haunted hospital wings, the wicked tortures, and how they were mean to all the residents. There are even stories of the tunnels being even scarier. I've spent many hours reading about this mysterious place, and if there is something on these grounds, it feels more like sadness, maybe a little loss. This could be because caring for the people who needed help was all this place knew, and so the emptiness is the loss of its purpose. In 1990, the local government took over control of the buildings, and for over a decade, the building sat empty. The local powers had no idea what to do with the empty building and the nearly 65 acres it was on, as well as if it could be reused. In 2000, the work to renovate Building 50 was started with the help of Ray Minervini. Building 50 and Calantha's grave were deemed historical markers by the government and will remain in their places for as long as possible. In closing, I've been a resident of Traverse City for a long time. June will be 17 years. In these years, I've grown to love the history and the legends of my home. This place I live is very interesting. Some of these stories include the Bowers Harbor Ghost, or the Michigan Dogman, which I may include on this in the future. They definitely give this place I call home a bit of mystery. I've spent many hours hiking and walking in and around the buildings, as well as the trails behind the hospital. As I read about the history of the hospital, I know the places where the buildings once stood very well. The buildings are now being renovated. Some have been renovated and have many uses now. There's affordable housing, markets, and shops, to name a few. The many hours I have spent there and the hours I plan to spend there in the future. There's always a feeling of longing in its atmosphere. There's no way to ignore it. It just takes a hold of you, and to some degree, you get to a point where you can't get enough. To put it simpler, this place, this old building of bricks, grows on you. Maybe it's all the history laid before you, or the mystery that calls to you there. And finally, I will leave you with a quote from Ray Minervini, from the introduction of Jack Kirchhoff's book, How Thin the Veil, a memoir of the 45 days spent in the Traverse City State Hospital. It's hard to believe today, but 20 years ago many people just wanted to tear down Building 50, often citing that it was just a place of sadness and despair. I've always believed that kind of thinking ignores the happiness and the hope that often flourished here, and the noble intent that compelled our state to build a sanctuary to care for our fellow human beings. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the night, and remember, this is just the beginning. This podcast is done in the memory of my grandfather, Al Aguirre.